somewhere past the edge of convention, beyond the boundaries of tomorrow, lies a special kind of impossible. A kind of impossible where pioneers forge ahead. Where no idea is too bold and no challenge too great. Because making a 200-ton airplane disappear is impossible until it's not. Predicting cyber attacks before they happen is impossible until it's not. And solving the mysteries of the universe is impossible until it's not. It's our job to break free from what is to what could be. Ready to leave the boundaries of what's known. To define possible.
All right. As we're trying to motivate people to get back in the room, stop their valuable discussions and sit and listen, which is always a challenge. We're about to get started here with our next session. I just did want to take a quick opportunity to first off thank Northrop Grumman for sponsoring today. Marty, thank you very much. We truly appreciate your support. Thank you to all the students for being here. You're helping make this a really lively event, and so we appreciate that. I want to thank really quickly my staff, Liana Porta, who does communications for us, and Marta Sotokova, who's working that registration desk. So she was the one behind all the badges and all that stuff. So I thank them very much. Thanks to Alan DeLuna, the president of the board of AS. We truly appreciate his leadership in helping put this whole thing together. Of course, the team at UAH, everybody involved, catering, everybody, our tech guys up there, Jacob and Caleb, and then the crew from SIVA Media, the guys behind the cameras and doing the Zoom thing and the recording. So we thank all of you for all the hard work. Thank you. So trying to get back on time here a little bit. We're running a little bit late, but that's okay. So we'll get started with this next session on policy. Building on success, a space policy look ahead to 2023. Once again, thanks to Northrop Grumman for your sponsorship. Our moderator for this session is Jeff Bingham. He is chairman and board member of the Virginia Commercial Spaceflight Authority, and he can take it away now. Thank you, Jeff.
This working all right? Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming back in. And it's not often you get a lot of people wanting to talk about policy, but actually I think we're going to have some interesting things to discuss. Based on the first discussions this morning, I've completely changed how I want to introduce the panel, so bear with me as I kind of stumble through and off the cuff effort. But that's a lot like how the policy process works, to be honest with you. So hopefully we'll have a good result. But I thought what General Shaw said this morning really struck me when he talked about we're at the beginning of the third space age. And I thought that was very insightful because it feels like that to me too. This conjunction of all the different space sectors coming together. But as he mentioned, a lot of what that means in terms of policy particularly hasn't always been or actually been thought through yet. And so I think what we'll do today is kind of raise some of those policy issues that maybe still need some work and some future work. At the same time, we talk about the foundation that was laid to get us to where we are now, which is what I take from the building from success part of that title. And the diversity in space, the changing role of government, all the different partnerships. All of these things are new and I think exciting developments in the whole way we can go about exploring space. And one example of that, it will be, I'll use, that kind of shows again the success we built in the past. And I'll use that as the policy surrounding the ISS National Lab, which is near and dear to me. I helped write the language that created the National Lab in 2005. And at that point, we didn't really know what we were doing. Just putting a name on the side of the spacecraft. In January of 2004, George Bush took a leaf out of his dad's playbook and announced the vision for space exploration, the Moon Mars Initiative, somewhat similar to the space exploration initiative that his dad had announced in 1989. But this time we were to go back and stay. Then the Congress looked at that over the next year and decided that, yeah, we like that idea. This is Congress collectively. When I say that, I'm referring to the committees of jurisdiction and the members of those committees and chair and leadership of those committees, and members who have had personal or constituent interests in space, which is a small subset of the entire body, but that's where the decisions are made primarily in terms of the specifics for policy from the legislative side of things. As you know, the policy process in the U.S. government is a combination of what the president proposes and the Congress disposes. And out of that bilateral activity comes ultimate space policy. And we were on the authorizing committee, all of us, and those are policy making committees for the Congress. And we guard that kind of jealously. And we, when the president issues a space policy, we say, thanks for sharing. And we go on and then try to do our work on coming up with what actually is the law, which trumps the policy, but that's a side issue. But with the space station, the only thing we didn't like about the vision for space exploration was that it said that the space station would be used for only research that would support the exploration of space beyond low Earth orbit. And back in the 90s, we had spent a lot of time in the Congress defending the space station as a multi-disciplinary research platform. And we were not about to let it all become space exploration externally oriented only. So we wrote in that legislation that at least 15% of all station research had to be non-exploration related. And that was the beginning of what set the stage for the designation of the ISS as a national laboratory, not the ISS, but the US segment of the ISS. And we did that. I told people the shorthand reason for doing that was we said to NASA, it's not yours. You can't decide alone what that space station is going to be used for. It needs to be multidisciplinary. And yes, you can do all your research for exploration purposes, but there's going to continue to be multidiscipline research across the board. We made that clear then, and then in the 2008 Act, we laid the groundwork again for expanding the actual meaning of what it meant to be a national lab. We asked NASA to come up with a study to do that. And that 2008 bill was also kind of a transitional bill. We had a presidential election going on, and we wanted to say, here's what the Congress, speaking as a whole in enacting legislation, thinks about space. Somewhat like the 2017 NASA Transition Act did the same thing. 2010, we really kind of put meat on the bones, particularly with space station, and created an external entity to take over and manage 50% of the entire U.S. research capacity aboard space station. That was a very significant event, and has I think resulted in a not reformation, but a kind of restoration, at least, of the multidisciplinary science activity aboard station that you'll hear about somewhat more this week as we go on. So what I like to characterize those three bills as kind of three chapters of a single book, establishing the basic policy for what we've done in the past on space stations. Now we're at a whole new crossroads. Now we're at the end of space station on the horizon. Excuse me. And we've got a lot of people interested in developing their own space stations, independent platforms. And again, you'll hear more details about that, and you'll hear from some of those folks in the next day or two. And this is a fascinating new development. And as the general again talked about, this tremendous diversity and array of new activity is just mind-boggling to me. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. You can tell I've been somewhere for a long time. This is the most exciting thing I've seen in all that history. And so I think we're at a perfect opportunity to be talking now about how do we lay the groundwork and make sure we have a policy framework, because those three bills I mentioned, they set the groundwork for where we are now. The 2010 Act wrote the language that required SLS to be built. And there it is on the pad, or about to be there. So, you know, that all got us to where we are now. It got the space station to where it is now. But where do we go from here? And, you know, what's the government role continuing in low Earth orbit? They say they want to stay in low Earth orbit as well as go explore, but what does that mean? How much of the government activity will remain in low Earth orbit? What will NASA support? Will it support only its research, or what happens to all of those other multidisciplines? You know, are we at another inflection point where they suddenly begin to feel like they're not going to have the option to continue doing their research on whatever follows the ISS? So those are questions that I think the future policy, the current policymakers need to start wrestling with. And so what I'm going to do is with that background, just to ask each of our panelists, we've got a great group of people here, to introduce themselves individually, and then take a couple minutes to address any issues there that you think are appropriate. What are you thinking about ought to be, what needs to be done? What do you think should be done? What are your priorities that you think on the policy horizon are in front of the Congress now? Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Well, it's great to be back in Huntsville. This is probably my third time coming to Van Braun, and so always good to be here and enjoy this conference. I'm Joel Graham, a partner with Meeks, Butera in Israel. It's a law firm in DC. Recently joined in August after 3 years at the Senate Commerce Committee, handling space policy for Ranking Member Roger Wicker from Mississippi. And in that time, we saw a lot of change, not just at NASA, but within the commercial space sector and others, from different modes of contracting, different modes of partnering with industry to new ideas and new concepts and innovation coming on around the horn. So kind of managing that change and crafting the policy for it was really our job at the committee. In August, before I left, we passed a NASA authorization bill as part of the CHIPS and Science Act, kind of a slimmed down version that supported the Space Launch System as our national super heavy lift capability, and supported NASA's goals of Artemis to return to the moon and go to Mars. Since then, I've kind of building a specialty in the regulatory side, and there's big challenges that are to be solved there. Obviously, when we talk about mission authorization, remote sensing, space safety, and others, there's a lot of questions and novel things to look at. Some of them as they relate to NASA missions and programs, and some of them as they relate to purely commercial activities. In 2019, we had the Space Frontier Act of 2019. It was a commercial space, kind of an update to the Commercial Space Launch Act that would have done several things, but we ended up pivoting to a NASA authorization and weren't able to get that done. But I am hopeful to see a commercial space bill come through in the next Congress and see those updates needed on those big policy questions. So I don't know if it was by design we had the Senate on this side and the House on that side, but it's good to be here, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
I'm going to defer to Pam because she's in the majority, and I'll follow up. I already deferred to the House of Lords over there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Pam Whitney. I'm with the staff on the majority for the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology in the House. I work specifically with the Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics. I'll start with my usual caveat that what you'll hear from me is just my own thoughts and comments. They don't represent any formal positions of the committee. As Jeff already mentioned, you know, we're an authorizing committee, so we set the sort of policy for the U.S. civil space and commercial space looking ahead, and it's kind of both a strategic look, as well as we also carry out oversight and do the deep dives, ensure that programs and the laws that have been put into place are being followed as intended by Congress. our committee as a whole has jurisdiction, and our subcommittee, I'll speak for that, has jurisdiction broadly over civil and commercial space and international space, including NASA, as well as the Office of Space Commerce at the Department of Commerce, the Office of Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs also at the Department of Commerce. We have jurisdiction over FAA's aviation research and development. We have jurisdiction over the National Space Council and commercial space writ large and international cooperation in space. So a very broad sort of jurisdiction, which allows us to look very broadly across space as a whole in the civil sector. I'm just going to touch on three things and sort of probably in the Q&A, maybe get more to the future and some of the issues there. But I think to start really thinking about the recent successes. NASA's just had a real string of exciting and inspiring successes. And I think it's really the culmination of a lot of work and perseverance, ingenuity, OSIRIS-REx. Needless to say, JWST is surpassing all expectations. And the recent DART first, planetary defense demonstration, it's hard to, shy away from what those successes mean. And also the fact that the International Space Station has for over 20 years been safely and successfully supporting human occupancy in space, living and working day after day. So it's really it's really, again, building on such amazing string of successes. And in terms of policy, there's really, Jeff did a great job of sort of giving you sort of the outline of some of the NASA authorizations that have supported the policy, especially a balanced agency. That's one of the things our members really care about, is supporting NASA as a whole: science, aeronautics, space technology, human exploration, STEM, just the entire package. And the authorizations really have built upon each other. And this recent NASA authorization in the CHIPS and Science Act included a set of core policy provisions that in some ways get to maybe a little bit more into the how. Congress has for a long time supported human exploration, for instance, stepping stone approach, moon to Mars, beyond, looking at building exploration and learning, with each interim step. And this most recent authorization kind of puts a little bit more focus on the how, setting up a formal Moon to Mars program, providing some direction to NASA on key technologies, key enabling technologies like space nuclear propulsion, which is for the longest time been one of the key technologies and capabilities needed to get to Mars. And then areas like supporting aeronautics, a robust aeronautics program, and sustainable aviation. This authorization goes into quite a bit of direction on encouraging and directing NASA to be investing in the R&D that's going to help for a sustainable future of aviation. Also areas of planetary defense. Again, that's been an area that Congress and our committee has actually spearheaded even back in the early 2000s, with direction on looking for potentially hazardous near-Earth objects. And that's, back then it wasn't probably considered as it might have been had a little bit of a giggle factor, but now it's it's truly an active program at NASA that blends science and applications. So that's really part of what this most recent authorization does. And there's challenges to ensuring that that is allowed to get implemented successfully. I mean, I'm excited that there are students here in the audience, because one of the things we hear about a lot is the workforce. And that's going to be critical to the success of implementing these policies, putting these policies into true practice. And you're going to be a part of that. And so that's going to be something that has to be taken seriously as we look ahead, is having, folks like you with the right skills and experience and opportunities to help, bring that to fruition in the coming decades. Infrastructure has been one area that, we've got 80% of NASA's infrastructure is from the Apollo era. And so that's going to be a key to ensuring that, again, we look to the future and build on past successes and getting that infrastructure that's needed to, again, align with the policy goals. So I'll stop there. And again, there's plenty to talk about in terms of other future issues in commercial and whatnot, but I'll turn it over to Tom.
Good. I think it's still morning. Yeah, my name's Tom Hammond. I work for the House Science Committee, the minority staff. Thankfully, Pam went first so she could talk about the jurisdiction and get that out of the way and the normal housekeeping stuff. I'll follow up with the normal caveat as well that I'm speaking for myself, not on behalf of the committee. It's usually a thing that we have to say to not get fired on Capitol Hill, and make sure that we're representing our bosses. Usually we're seen but not heard. So it's rare for us to get out here and actually talk, but it is important for us to hear kind of from where stakeholders are, and both from academia, from industry, and even from international partners to some extent. Just a little bit more narrowly tailored background of the folks that I work for on the science committee and the minority side. To Jeff's point, we do have a lot of consistency, and that's one of the things that the committees provide, and that's largely based upon the makeup of the committees. On the science committee, we have Dr. Babin, who represents the Johnson Space Center. He's a ranking member. Mr. Posey, who represents the Kennedy Space Center. Mr. Brooks, who represents Marshall. Mr. Gonzalez is right next to Glenn. Mr. Walsh is just north of Kennedy Space Center and represents Embry-Riddle, right above KSC. Mr. Baird represents Purdue, the home of most astronauts for university, which he always reminds us of. Mr. Garcia represents Armstrong. Ms. Kim represents Southern California with a lot of aerospace industries, as well as very close to JPL. And Mr. Obernolte represents Goldstone. So it's not by accident that people end up on the science committee because of their district interests. And it's not by accident that they stay there. I like to think that the science committee is very important, but when taken into consideration with the other committees in Congress, like Armed Services or Ways and Means or Appropriations, members tend to move on if they don't have a direct interest, which leaves the folks that do stick around that have district interests in NASA and space being very consistent, sticking around, and rising the levels of leadership pretty quickly. So that provides that consistency over multiple different years, and that constancy of purpose through multiple different authorization bills. To kind of weather the storms of different administrations, policy positions, even different economic conditions. So that's a little bit of background. It's really important to note that, I mean, the members that Pam represents as well, also represent a lot of NASA interests. And that really results in bipartisan legislation that comes out of our committee, which is very important. It makes our jobs a lot easier at the end of the day. It makes our jobs a lot more fun. I don't have to deal with tax policy and arguing with people. I think we have probably the best jobs on Capitol Hill that we deal with space exploration. Nobody's coming in and saying, this is horrible, why are we doing this? So, half the battle is already done by the time we show up in the morning. But it's important to recognize that the authorization, what we do, is separate from the appropriations process. The appropriators will come up with yearly funding for programs, projects, and activities. largely based upon the president's budget request, but that, as Jeff pointed out, is a recommendation and is sometimes followed and sometimes not. But authorization set caps. And they also, authorization committees conduct oversight to ensure that the executive branch is carrying out the laws and spending money the way Congress meant it to, which is very important, but I think people always forget. Oftentimes people forget about that as an important function of Congress. So that takes up a lot of our time. I don't want to chew up a lot of time here because I think having a conversation is probably the best. I want to focus on what people think about, but some of the things, that our members have been talking about recently, and I went back and pulled some of the general themes. And I'd like to kind of throw it out there to spark some conversations and see where folks are on three specific topics. One is acquisition strategies that NASA is employing and has for a number of years and has in the future, and really understanding what the second and third order effects of different strategies as they're selected. Everybody, I think, is on board with, maximizing taxpayer funding and getting the best value for taxpayer funding. But a lot of times I don't think people understand the potential impacts that those acquisition strategies will have on center operations, whether it's facilities, infrastructure, workforce, and technical capabilities, whether it's scientific or safety oriented. And in addition to whether or not NASA can be an informed buyer of services. So kind of understanding what Congress can do to better understand what those second and third order implications are of different acquisition strategies, I think was something that would be helpful. Second one is international participation. It goes without saying that international participation is a core tenet of NASA. It's been one of the rationales for space exploration since the dawn of the space age. It's important for soft power. It's a great means for strengthening enduring partnerships, bridging gaps with nations that may be potentially strained. Apollo-Soyuz test project comes to mind, and even partnering with new nations to bridge new connections. But as we kind of adopt these new acquisition strategies, how does that soft power aspect in international relations still as relevant? Government to government partnership is pretty clear. But as we move forward with government or private sector to government potential partnerships, or private sector to private sector from domestic to international, does that soft power influence still maintain with those new kind of arrangements? Whether it's astronaut swaps is one thing for flying on the shuttle or ISS. Private astronaut mission sales from one private sector U.S. company to a foreign nation. It's a different kind of interaction. And same thing for just private sector to private sector. So how does that work going forward? And then also, at what point what are the pros and cons of structuring international partnerships going forward? Do you place international partners on a critical path for exploration? And what are the risks that we're willing to accept for those? What are the benefits in terms of cost savings? And making sure that we understand those second and third order effects. Are we okay with putting a rover on the moon that is made by Toyota? It's a lot different than it being made by GM, right? From an international kind of perspective. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but there are things that are on a critical path, and there are things that can be augmented or complementary. And those are, we have to understand those implications going forward. I think a lot of members are thinking about that. And the third one, just real quick, is regulatory streamlining. A few years ago, Space Policy Directive 2, based on streamlining commercial space regulations, came out. Agencies took a bunch of action. Same thing with Space Policy Directive 3 with space situational awareness. So you had regulatory restructuring at the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. And then you also had some restructuring at NOAA's Office of Commercial Remote Sensing. They're the ones that regulate imaging of Earth. A lot was done on that. We're a few years down the road after that. Now we actually have some data, understanding where folks in industry, associations, trade groups, academia, how that's playing out, so that Congress can do some oversight to evaluate how to go forward, what needs to be tweaked, what doesn't. So those are the things that are on my mind, spark some conversation. Happy to have a conversation with everybody here. Thank you for coming and listening to a boring policy panel, rather than talking about hardware or seeing pretty pictures and actually doing something. But it is important, and we take it seriously. Thanks.
Yeah, because you don't get the hardware and the pretty pictures without the policy underpinning. Got to start somewhere. even as unglamorous as it may be. So I think we want to go to questions and get your comments and feedback and hopefully give you brilliant answers. I saw one up there.
Where was the hand? Who wanted to talk? There you go. Yes.
I'm gonna wait till it gets to the bottom.
I was lying.
This will be for Pam. You mentioned this in your comments that this authorization had a little bit of a how in terms of the Moon to Mars program office. What were your thoughts behind having that much? That's unusual for an authorization to see that level of detail on the how. So what was your thoughts behind it, including that in the authorization?
Well, it's really guided by some of the work that had been done by advisory bodies like the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, GAO, Government Accountability Office, and the NASA IG in terms of, commenting about some of the challenges of NASA not being, Artemis and Moon to Mars not being organized as an official program. As an official program, it follows all of the sort of policies and procedures that NASA has in place for managing its programs and projects. And so, and the other part of this is that these are amazingly complex developments, and there are several of them that are ongoing at the same time. And they're, looking at them in an integrated way as part of a whole and serving, goals and objectives is part of the intent behind that. And so if we're going to be serious about, getting back to the moon and onto Mars, the structures have to be put in place, the people, the structures, the policies to get us there. And that was part of the intent.
You guys have piqued my interest on the regulatory. When you started, Joel and Tom, then when you continued on. So we've had a lot of interest, new entrants from commercial space. Regulatory agencies have tried to accommodate some of that. We've also had some new entrants from nation states. So where do you guys see the regulatory consolidation so that a new entrant would understand how to actually get in and be regulated, and where do you see the moratorium and how things are going on new space flight?
Well, currently, when you look at the federal regulatory framework for space and for commercial space activities, it is fragmented. There are different pieces across different agencies and different parts of the government. And that's how it's evolved over the years. And it's based on kind of the strengths and the capabilities each of those departments, agencies, and offices provide. Obviously, we have kind of FAA does through the Office of Commercial Space Transportation does launch and reentry licensing. We have the commercial remote sensing at the Department of Commerce, and FCC is responsible for Spectrum. And we're trying to think about, with these new and novel activities coming online, be it satellite servicing or in-space manufacturing, sort of this ISAM concept, or commercial space stations, how do we license those, and what agency is going to have the responsibility for fulfilling the authorization point of view of that? It's always an interesting, you have to strike a balance, especially when you have an industry that is this young and this dynamic and changing and evolving, to make sure that you get that regulatory framework or authorization framework right, so that it's not so onerous that it pushes entrants out and it stifles the industry before it has a chance to, pardon the pun, take off. But you also don't want to make sure that it's so loose that you're not fulfilling our obligations, for instance, under the Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says we have to maintain continuing supervision over U.S. things in space. And so it is a balance to strike. It's going to be an interesting conversation in Washington. One of the big questions that's going on right now in terms of the authorization piece is what's the appropriate agency to license these kind of emerging space activities. There are some that think the FAA or the Department of Transportation is the right agency to do it. Others think the Department of Commerce is a good place to put it. I happen to fall in the Commerce camp for a handful of reasons. Number one, you have an agency or a department that is used to working with industry. I mean, that's a lot of what Department of Commerce does, is interface with the private sector. They have a lot of different resources and parts to pull from, be it NIST, the standard and technology, or the export control side, or be it weather, and of course the space safety and Office of Space Commerce there that is charged with promoting industry, right? So there's a lot of different places to pull from, and I think Commerce is probably the most agile and makes the most sense for placing these highly dynamic activities in terms of authorization. That's going to be something that's going to require Congress to speak to. It was one of the big questions sort of on my mind before I left the committee, and I'm sure it's on my colleagues' minds as well, in terms of how to set that up and how to establish it. I know the National Space Council is thinking about it as well. They're planning on having a series of listening sessions soon on it. And so you're right, there's some big questions to answer there in terms of how we regulate and how we authorize these missions. Now, eventually at some point in the future, to your second point about consolidation, it may consolidate over time, but I don't see that as a near-term development. I see that as a more long-term development. I mean, coming from sort of my political philosophy, I'm hesitant to stand up completely new agencies and completely new departments until there is a serious need for doing so. And in doing so, you run some risks there, because once you consolidate and as you start to pull pieces and bits out of agencies, there's a risk that you lose expertise. There's a risk that you lose the institutional knowledge and the expertise that the agencies have. Actually, we ran into it recently a little bit with the NTSB wanting to, and they issued a proposed rule on commercial space accident investigation, which Congress, we took an issue with how that was drafted because of the expertise with safety being at FAA. And so in working with those agencies, they actually worked together to update a longstanding memorandum of agreement between the two of them. And so that was, we were good to see the collaboration there. And it's certainly, there will be more work to do, but in terms of consolidation, I don't think now is yet the time to start really standing up new agencies and new departments on that. I think we need to get the questions answered in terms of what the law is going to be and how this is going to be licensed or authorized or regulated. And then we can start looking at those bigger kind of framework questions or agency questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Charlie Stegemuller with SAIC. I was a longtime inside NASA employee until about 10 years ago and joined SAIC. Picking up on Tom's question and Pam, your response, it seems I have a memory of 1993 with the space station program. We moved it from the Freedom Project setup, where it was a many-to-many, very, very cumbersome operating model, to the integrated alpha model. That took legislative authority. It took an enactment process to go to it. Since then, there have been several instances of direct direction coming from Congress or the executive branch that directs NASA to behave certain ways. In a change to enable them to achieve this Artemis class type of mission, what's the appetite for Congress to letting NASA do its job and backing out some of the directed steps that have come out legislatively over the last 25 years?
I'll take it. I think Jeff chime in at any point, but I think Congress weighs in when various administrations don't do what the existing law tells them to do. So when NASA varies from the established law, either derived from the 1958 Act or established in Title 51 post 2010, I think that's when you get course corrections legislatively. I think at least going back to 2000, and certainly from Jeff's point in 2005, Congress has been, extremely consistent in what it's been asking NASA to do. And it's only in instances where NASA fails to achieve or conduct activities pursuant to those legislative directions is when Congress legislates to provide those course corrections.
If I can jump in on that too, you know, coming at it from a little different. So I was part of the Senate side negotiation of the Authorization Act there. And from our perspective, we were looking at kind of the do no harm first as our principle. And we were noticing, you know, to give NASA credit, they were taking steps to integrate a lot of these different pieces. And I think that there are reasons for how those different programs that compiled the Artemis effort originated and kind of started off on as their own programs and proceeded based on that. And so when we were thinking about how to do this, certainly we were cognizant of the ASAP and other bodies' recommendations, but we didn't want to upset the apple cart. And we didn't want to slow down the progress NASA was making. Now, it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how, you know, whether we were effective in striking that balance. But that was kind of the approach we took, as we noticed NASA was starting to think about this, integrating the program architecture, and we wanted to make sure that what we did in law was not going to upset that. For instance, actually on a slightly different piece of it, there was a big discussion over the human landing system for NASA and how that was moving forward and whether we as Congress should speak to that. The Senate, we had some slightly different ideas from the House on that, but we ended up omitting the section on that and didn't want to upset the progress and didn't want to slow NASA down in doing that. So we stayed silent on it. But from the Senate perspective, we were trying to say, it's great to, you know, we're certainly charged with overseeing and providing that oversight, but we also don't want to slow down the progress being made.
Let me join them with a similar, is something else down there?
Yeah, I
Anything
just want
else?
to jump in quickly on that, if I
Go ahead,
may.
Jeff.
And going back to my example I used earlier about the space station, you know, in 2005, before that, in 2004, as I said, the president came by and announced the vision. Between that point in January of 2004 and the following January of 2005, 900 of the 931 principal investigators on the space station were let go, were gone. We had a huge uproar in the scientific community saying, you know, this can't be happening to us. We spent years and millions getting ready to go launch payloads on the space station. So we came in and took a firm stance and said, no, you know, you will not, you will have to at least carve out 15%, which wasn't a huge amount, $150 million in actual terms and value, but we made the point. And again, further, we said the space station is not yours. That's why we made it a national laboratory, because it's not just yours to decide, because this is what NASA's priorities are. Now, obviously, NASA was drawing its instructions from the president. It was a vision for space exploration that had the words in it to end station science other than exploration related science. Then in the 2008 bill, we came back and said, we asked NASA to go ahead and come up with a report to us on how best to structure that national laboratory. So we kind of, you know, it took the good cop, bad cop one year, and then next year gave them back what we thought was the appropriate kind of guidance to help us do our job to put the refinements in place that eventually became the International Space Station National Laboratory. So, Pamela,
So along that same line, Jeff, we have CASIS has developed some expertise in management of research and development on station. How do we apply that expertise to the developments in the commercial LEO destinations programs? How do we get CASIS able to support and help manage things going to them and not lose that expertise? We already talked a couple of minutes ago about loss of expertise. How do we avoid losing that expertise as station declines and commercial LEO development increases?
Well, it's important, and this is critical. It's a good question. It's important to make sure that you have the continuity. In the Authorization Act, we extended ISS authorization to 2030, and there was an important reason for doing that, is because we need to make sure that we keep the station we have before the others, or while we get the others online. The last thing that we want is a gap in LEO microgravity research capability. The problem is, and you know, it's easy to compare it to the commercial crew or the crew gap between space shuttle and commercial crew. But a gap with station and a gap in microgravity would be even worse, because what would happen is it would leave China as the only nation with a space station, and it would drive all of that research and all of that activity to China. And I dare say we would never get that back. When commercial crew came online, we were able to resume transportation of astronauts to station, and we were able to close that gap. But if everything goes to China in the absence of a Western, a US and international partner-led effort in microgravity, we would never get that back. So it's important that we make sure to bring that in and ensure there's a smooth transition. We've asked NASA for a transition plan in that regard, and so they're looking at it. But you're right, having that continuity is absolutely critical.
I think, you know, LEO and ISS transition is really on the forefront, at least of some of our members and my mind as we look ahead and understanding what is the strategy. And we know we need to have a transition and avoid a gap. We know that we've got commercial stations that are in process working on designs and some close to bending metal. But there are a whole host of other questions in terms of, you know, what the US government's role is going to be in LEO as a user. And Tom mentioned the international partnerships and what that's going to look like. But just even at the sort of more tactical level, just understanding some of the nuts and bolts of the transition and understanding NASA's requirements so that those can be fed to the commercial space station potential providers who are in the active process of designing and understanding what the researchers need as they look ahead and how the nuts and bolts of their research is going to actually transition from ISS to other platforms. And you raise the question of also CASIS and the national lab. And that's another question that feeds into sort of this overarching issue of what is our strategy and what are we doing to address some of these questions under that umbrella to make sure that we don't have a gap and that we have a seamless transition that maintains our strength in LEO now and our ability to leverage that strength looking ahead.
Bueller, there we go, over here. Run the stairs. Thank you.
Hi, Nicholas McClave from the University of Louisiana. So I was wondering, with the growing commercialization of LEO and projected commercialization of eventually the moon, are there any plans to formalize and then potentially enforce existing planetary protection policies? And just to clarify, by planetary protection, I'm referring to the contamination of other planetary bodies by human intervention.
I know I'm not going to comment on it.
I'll jump in. We're jumping to the fray. So you have planetary protection. It derives itself from two kind of different thought processes. NASA develops its own planetary protection for its own purposes to preserve scientific investigations, specifically for the search for life going forward. And then there is limitations or restrictions or principles derived from the Outer Space Treaty from 1967. Outer Space Treaty of 1967 does not mention the word planetary protection. That is a NASA term. It's also embodied in COSPAR and COPIOS. However, the Outer Space Treaty does say as a principle that signatories should refrain from harmful contamination to preserve future investigations and preserve future exploration. And I think it says even caveats it by saying shall avoid harmful contamination. So there's a should versus you have to do something versus you should do something. Is the United States legally obligated to establish and regulate planetary protection guidelines? I would humbly submit that we are not. Should we? The United States and NASA already does and will continue to. And there are ways of effectuating the same outcome absent a regulatory approach. Congress did so with addressing Apollo heritage sites a couple of years ago by requiring, if anybody's going to the moon, most likely you're going to partner with NASA somehow, either through a contract, a grant, Space Act agreement. Somehow you're going to use a deep space network. You're going to use testing facilities. You're going to avail yourself of that expertise at NASA. So what that law basically said was, if you are partnered with NASA, which you probably are, then you're gonna have to follow NASA's guidelines. Now, that's not a regulatory approach, but for the foreseeable future, those types of endeavors, the difference between should we and that is you're managing a lot of different kind of competing priorities. The surest way to prevent or to ensure planetary protection is never send a person in. But I think we want to send people to explore. If we don't, then I think a significant portion of NASA's human spaceflight budget can be eliminated. But I think we do want to send people there. If we're going to send people there, you can't have very stringent planetary protection concerns because we have a lot of bugs on us.
I think that this is an area where there's a lot of dialogue that is, I think, starting to happen, but needs to continue to happen in terms of diverse stakeholders. I mean, in the past, it was largely a scientific conversation at science conferences like COSPAR, which is the sort of de facto body for the science guidelines for planetary protection. But it now is starting to include, industry and other players, and that dialogue needs to continue to occur. Also, planetary protection, we have to recognize, NASA's long-standing expertise in this area, and as it has, been the implementer and has a lot of experience. We also can bring together, industry and other players to sort of look at this in terms of, are there other ways to get to the same ends and ensure that we can still, effectively search for life and don't discover our own, and also find cost-effective and ways of ensuring, spacecraft cleanliness and so forth. But it's an area of dialogue, an area that needs to continue to be thought through looking ahead.
I'll just quickly, before Frank's questions, mention the first time I met Elon Musk was in 2001 in NASA headquarters. He came in to see Dan Golden, who was then the NASA administrator, to talk about his ideas of terraforming Mars. So it's a big question that still has to be answered at some point. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, real quick. First of all, thanks to the three most recent current staffers. I got to figure out how I phrase this because I'm not including Jeff in this, but you guys did a great job. Got an authorization out last year. I think it surprised a lot of people. A lot of good content in there relative to Artemis and relative to SLS. Not so much in some other areas. Do you think it'll be some probability we'll have another authorization in the next year or two? And I know that's hard to predict when you don't even know who's going to be the chair of the committee at this point in time. But do you think there's motivation out there to do a more comprehensive authorization?
I think there's still other areas that the committee and Congress wants to address. I think, as I mentioned, ISS transition is a big policy issue. Looking ahead, also, there are questions on sort of the acquisition that Tom mentioned, acquisition questions, and how that, what are we understanding about some of the practices that that we've been learning about, and how are those working? And so there are a lot of areas, and I think we'll see what happens in 2023.
Yeah, trying to look into my Senate crystal ball for a second, I think you will see an effort on the Senate side as well. Obviously, leadership changes coming into the Senate Commerce Committee on the Republican side, and I think there is a lot, as you mentioned, a lot left on the table, a lot of different difficult issues to solve. We had the Senate NASA authorization bill was a more full-featured authorization, but just due to the time constraints on when we were negotiating, weren't really able to work through a lot of the stuff that was in there and talking to the House. And so I think there's still a lot to be done, and the clock's ticking. And with new leadership coming in and the changes at the committee, I think you'll see an interest in getting an authorization bill drafted and worked through. It's interesting. Someone recently told me or repeated the phrase that there's no rocket equation for policy. And it kind of stuck because, the technical challenges of Artemis and science and Leo and the things that we're trying to do, I don't have any problem. I think we'll get those solved. It's the policy that's in many ways a trickier problem sometimes to solve and takes a lot of smart people working on it and thinking about it. So hope to see that continued effort.
It's literally our job. That's what we have to do. So, I mean, if we don't want to do it, I can collect a paycheck and just go home. But I mean, it's what we do. It's what we all prepare to. We all do. There are things that are outside of our control, right? There are floor time, there are competing priorities. There are other things that are going on. We have an FAA reauthorization we have to come up and do. We have the expiring learning period for or moratorium, depending upon how you want to term it. There's just a lot of other things going on. So, it's those kind of decisions are made above our pay grade, but we're standing by and we can work pretty quick.
One last thing I'll add, that really puts a big bold underscore on why bipartisanship is so important here, because Tom mentioned floor time and debating the bill on the floor. We did when we passed the NASA Authorization Act through the Senate, it was by unanimous consent in 2019, at the end of 2019. It had to be that way. And when I came into Commerce with Senator Wicker to lead the process, I said, this is going to be a bipartisan bill. We're going to each have an equal stake in it. We'll talk our way through things, and we're all going to be proud of the product at the end of the day. And it's because we did that. It's because there has been so much effort put into creating bipartisan consensus on this is how we've been able to make the progress we've made. And if you look at the historical sort of instances of human spaceflight in particular, and Jeff knows this well, there were fits and starts. There were times that an administration would start something and a subsequent administration would come in and say, no, that was the last guy's thing and we're going to do something different. But now we have bipartisan consensus and support for Artemis. We have it throughout the NASA framework, and we need to make sure that we protect that, because that doesn't happen on accident. That is something that takes a lot of hard work by those in Congress, by those in the administration, those at NASA to make work. And so we need to make sure we maintain that bipartisan effort.
Yeah,
I echo that. I just wanted to chime in again about the recent authorization and echo what the comment about the time constraint. We were in we did that in a constrained way. There was a lot more that we would like to put into the authorization. We're really pleased that we got into these core policies in the act, but there is more to be done. So.
Yeah, we had 18 years of that consistency and bipartisanship. And so the true test, I think, is going to be, can we maintain that going into this next new age of space? And that's an open question. But I think it would be our challenge as a group, because we were able to do it, that whoever comes along, follow that use that as an ultimate objective. Because otherwise we go nowhere.
Panel, thank you very much. This has been really interesting back and forth. We really like the back and forth. Thanks, Frank, for helping put it together. Jeff, thank you for pulling the folks together.